Good morning and welcome to Morning Scoop for Monday, May 2nd. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Notre Dame game is in 125 days, the game against Michigan in 209 days. You probably don't need me to tell you that name, image, and likeness rights have become a big story in college athletics over the last year. And now the Ohio High School Athletic Association just opened up voting from member schools to determine if high school athletes in the state should be able to capitalize on their NIL rights as well. My guest today is Marcus Hartman of the Dayton Daily News. He actually attended the meeting where the OHSAA discussed that proposed change. Marcus, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So this is obviously going to be a much smaller scale thing if it does go through than NIL has turned into in college. But, less money on the deal, fewer athletes who are making any appreciable amount of money. So why is the OHSAA thinking about doing this?
They actually said, they came out straight and said that we're afraid if we don't change our rules now, that we'll either get sued or the state will change the law. And I actually don't think they'll get sued because, as someone else pointed out to me, since a lawsuit would probably cost more than the actual NIL deal would be worth. But you never know. But they may not get sued. But and when Doug Uke, the the executive director of the OHSAA, actually said he talked to like a lawmaker of some ilk, and he said, "Well, we don't actually give you guys any money, right?" And no, because they're a private organization. And he says, "Well, we don't really care what you do that much." But someone else pointed out to me, it is still something that maybe somebody could throw into like a budget bill or something and just get passed along with everything else. And you never know what kind of unintended consequences could have with it. So to make a long story short, they want to just kind of get a rule that they think makes sense taken care of, and rather than have something that they don't like imposed on them. And they did sort of imply that even if this vote doesn't pass, it might give them a little bit of legal cover, at least if they could at least say, well, we did consider it in our membership, voted it down, at least for now. And the other thing it's easy to go is they basically just copied like what the executive order from Ohio is for college, and I guess New York, whatever New York's rules are, they kind of went after that. But it's pretty much all the same thing. You can't. It has to be just for the player. It can't be like your uncle can't get himself a deal off of your name, and you can't also do like a team-wide thing. Like if you can't say, that may be more to protect the advertisers. Like if you have one great player that you can't come back and say, well, we want a team-wide thing. It has to be individual. And there's the same restrictions on like alcohol and tobacco and gambling and stuff like that. So it's very similar to what has passed for college athletes in Ohio.
Yeah, and the voting on that proposal is now open. It opened on Sunday, May 1st. It's going to run through May 16th. And you mentioned some of the guardrails they put in place there. There are a few others. They can't use the school names. You can't do it in your uniform. You can't use the logo. You can't wear a sponsor's logo on your uniform during games. You can't do anything NIL related during practices, games, team events, whatever. It feels like, and I think they basically came out and said, like, this is not going to be something that, thousands of kids are getting big NIL deals. You're not going to have hundreds of kids driving brand new cars around or anything like that. There may not be more than a handful of players in any given year who do get, a car or something like that. But the one thing that could end up happening that's kind of interesting is something that opened up at the college level where you can now legally get paid to give lessons. So like a hockey player can get paid to be a hockey instructor or a tennis player or anyone else, that. So this is something that, the big names, the big deals, whatever the 2022 equivalent of LeBron James getting a Hummer, getting a Humvee when he was a high school kid, whatever the equivalent of that is, that'll affect the LeBron Jameses and maybe a few other, Ohio State caliber athletes in the state, but that's probably it. But, to at least be able to, give other kids an opportunity to make a little bit of money based on their sports, their sports abilities. I mean, that seems like that's, if that's how it works out, that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad summer job for a kid to have, teaching tennis lessons or whatever if they're a tennis player.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting. I always thought in the previous discussions from the college level about doing it was more like, well, this money is available. The original discussions were, well, this money is available, so they should be able to take advantage of it. And then we kind of gradually shifted into, well, actually, maybe there's not that much money available. And now, right now, we're in the middle of trying to figure out exactly how much money is available and what money that gets reported as legit and all that with colleges. And there's a bunch of variables involved in that. And by the time, since we've been having that discussion for a year, now at the high school level, the discussion is almost more, well, there's not really any reason to not allow this. And it might be illegal to not allow it. So let's just allow it. It's probably better to allow it than not allow it, even though there are, some potential unintended consequences too that, you could run into just with, the like everything else, further commercializing things, and you maybe create some tension on a team if one kid has a deal and stuff like that, and these are all legitimate kind of negative things. So yeah, it's interesting the parallels that do and don't exist with the college thing, because even the college thing, I think when it all shakes out, I don't think there's going to be that many people getting huge deals in college either. There's a kind of a side thing where you've got boosters and people who are sort of trying to make it so there's almost just an extra salary basically for as many players on whatever program they care about as possible. And you could maybe see something like that in high school, but I don't know that money is really there to provide that, and there's less of an impetus to do it since everyone in college is recruited, whereas most kids are not recruited in the high school level. But that kind of segues into one of the big potential problems really would be recruiting. And now the OHSAA's stance on this, which is not completely invalid, is that recruiting is already illegal, which is true, but it's kind of hard to prove it if recruiting occurs. And if you change residences legitimately, basically you can go to another school if you want to. Beyond that, there is a big loophole in that in the recruiting rules, if you go to a public school, you can go to a private school anywhere, no questions asked. So it would open up a huge opportunity for private schools to bring in kids. Now they still have recruiting rules as well, but again, I'm sure that those are broken from time to time. And not only that, but there is the possibility, like as I talked to the athletic director at Alter, who is also the girls basketball coach, and their girls basketball program has won like 5 state championships in the last 10 or 12 years. And she was the one person that I talked to who was like absolutely against it. Everyone else I talked to was kind of like, well, maybe it's not my favorite thing, but we kind of have to do it. And there's some positives. She was like, said, no, I'm totally against it. And the thing that came up in that conversation was theoretically, you could have someone who was a rich graduate of a private school who could all on their own, because the schools can't have anything to do with it, which is another thing that's kind of parallel with the colleges, could all on their own recruit a kid, offer them some sort of deal, and let's say that all goes through, that could end up getting the school in trouble, with the school literally not knowing that someone is like basically offering to break the rules on their behalf. And that's besides you get to the point where people who might intentionally cheat too, but you know what I mean? So it's that's actually maybe the biggest potential issue of all, I think, in terms of what it might do for legitimate and illegitimate recruiting, especially from a public to private school standpoint.
We have seen one example, at least previously, where the NIL high school thing sort of spilled over into the college game, and that was the case of Quinn Ewers, who, there's all sorts of theories out there now about, why he did what and when he did what, when he did it and all that kind of stuff. But, he had a big NIL deal lined up with a kombucha company. That seems like that's not in any doubt. And at least part of the impetus to reclassifying to 2021 was that he couldn't capitalize it under the rules for Texas high school football. So I looked this up, and you apparently had looked the same thing up. According to Open Doors, which is one of the big NIL companies, there are currently 9 or 10 states, depending on how you want to define things, where NIL is currently confirmed legal for high school students. Like California, you can do it. Louisiana, you can do it. But rather notably, Texas, Georgia, Florida, a bunch of the big southern states, are still not, they are still like a big red, like it's not being considered right now. It's not being discussed. It's just, no, you can't do it. So with as much as NIL collectives have sort of upped the amount of money available to athletes at the college level, I'm starting to wonder, was this at all a decision that, does the possibility of not losing players early to the college game, did that factor at all into the conversation for the OHSAA? And then, do you think we might in future years see a disproportionate maybe number of those early enrollee kids coming from Texas or Florida or Georgia or other states like that have very big football programs, very high profile recruits who can't capitalize on that until they get to college?
I don't think the OHSAA was worried about that at all. I think that OHSAA really was just worried about getting sued more than anything. I mean, I think really more than that, because that's their director of compliance kind of presented everything, and that's what they led with. So I really think the OHSAA itself, that's the main thing they were concerned with. And this kind of anything is generated by members, obviously. And I did bring that up with anybody that I talked to, and everyone kind of agreed, yeah, it would be better if there were an Ohio Quinn Ewers. It's better for Ohio if they are playing high school sports. You could have a situation where, you could have a kid, the occasional kid who really could make enough money that it would be worth moving. Because that's another kind of aspect of it. Again, I don't know if I mentioned this specifically or not, but, one of the things with the recruiting is if you were going to move for an NIL deal on the up and up, like legitimately change residences and stuff, that would most likely cost more than like 99% of the NIL deals that would be available. So it wouldn't be worth it to you if you literally needed to go rent an apartment or let alone buy a new house or whatever. It's generally assumed that most NIL deals will not be worth enough to offset that. But if you do have the occasional Quinn Ewers who would maybe be worth $1 million or more, then it's a legitimate, and you don't even, we always kind of automatically say, well, somebody being guilty or whatever, but not guilty, greedy on that. But you never know. Everybody's family situation is different. You could have someone who's from a very rough background who really even just a few $100,000 would drastically change their life's path and their family's life path, especially in the short term. So, that is something. It's better to avoid that if possible. So I think that's another benefit. And there's really no positive to me. There was no positive at all involved with Quinn Ewers leaving his high school and going to Ohio State. Literally, it wasn't a good idea for anybody. And I thought that at the time. And the way it worked out was like by far the most predictable way that it was going to work out. But even before it happened, who knows if he came in and actually played by some miracle, or even if whatever last fall was thrown away, but he still stayed at Ohio State and eventually became the starter and stuff like that. It still was not a good deal as far as I'm concerned. And as far as all the reporting was, he did not have a family need. It was just more of they wanted to be able to capitalize just because they could. But so there are many kids that you could have a possibility where it would be much more of a need to actually cash in at some level. So I think that whether or not the OHSAA was considering that in the first place, that is a legitimate thing as well, especially when you talk about the difference in some people that really could have a great need to make money immediately as soon as possible. I mean, literally, if it was just someone whose family situation, they just to pay the mortgage or whatever. So I think that's a big aspect of it. And even if it only applies to a few people, it's still, again, especially if it only applies to a few people, the positives probably do outweigh the negatives. But we kind of have to see how it plays out.
So, I mean, it sounds to me, and this is kind of was my thinking as well, it sounds to me like you're thinking they probably, maybe more likely than not, that this does pass. Because, I mean, the OHSA went through a rough, they went through a rough year financially a couple of years ago, as did many people and many organizations, with the cancellation of the basketball tournament and all that stuff, and football. The football tournament went away, and all that stuff, and the juice may not be worth the squeeze here. To your point, this isn't impacting a ton of people potentially. And if the downside risk is expensive lawsuits you might have to deal with for, a long time, and then based on how the court stuff has played out in the past, you're probably not going to win those lawsuits. So, the juice may just not be worth the squeeze there for them. So the votes, obviously, the voting goes for another 2 weeks from today is when that closes on the 16th. But what is your sense for how this ends up?
I'm not really sure. I could kind of see it. I could see it going any way because there's 800 and some schools that are going to be voting. And, the majority of the people that I talked to, even if they didn't really like it, they were probably going to vote for it. But then no one said for sure that they were going to vote for it or against it. And even Alter's athletic director didn't say for sure they were going to vote against it. She just said she didn't like it. She personally opposed it, but that doesn't mean they were going to vote against it. They might, but that doesn't mean that they would. And that'd only be one vote. So it's kind of hard to guess. Because you also, and this is almost in the voting of anything where lots of people vote, you don't know how many districts aren't even going to bother to think about it. And so if you don't think about it, what's your knee jerk reaction? It's probably to vote no. Or maybe it's to vote yes. And again, to just say, well, whatever, who cares? It won't matter. And then I'll just vote yes. So it's hard to predict. I mean, I suppose if I absolutely had to guess, maybe I'd take the pessimistic side and say it's easier to vote no and say don't forget about it and not think about it than it would be to maybe noodle it all the way through and say, well, maybe it's 51-49 in my mind pro, which is kind of where I think a lot of people that I talk to are coming from. Because there is an interesting subplot. So everybody that I talked to, obviously LeBron, there's a LeBron case that was, 20 some years ago. That was almost exactly 20 years ago. And more recently, everybody's recent Southwest Ohio example was Luke Kennard, which was still like 5 or 6 years ago. But he was a real big deal, and even when he was like a sophomore. So if anybody was going to be able to do traditional endorsement deals, that's pretty good, a pretty good reason. The other thing, as an aside, is it's hard to really rule anything out because you never know. Because there's towns of 1 to 2 million people in the state of Ohio. So you never know what's going to happen. There may be some medium-sized town where, the car dealership does want to give money to some kid. And I mean, I think a lot of NIL deals, and it's somewhat that way in college too, but even in high school, I think a lot of deals could just really be somebody in the community that just wants to give somebody money for the heck of it. Or you could have someone who, again, even if it's not a major deal, but you could still have someone who in your community has an economic hardship. And this would create an easy avenue for someone to say, you know what, it would help out this family if I gave them $1,000. Maybe nobody would care if we did this anyway, but now we know specifically that it's legal to have them just come out and shake hands with people for a little while. I can give them some money and help out. So that's a positive. But there is a guy, Gabe Cupps, who's the point guard at Centerville. He's going to be a senior next year. And is the reigning Mr. Basketball. He's going to Indiana. He has 374,000 Instagram followers. And that is the other big thing. And that if you're over 20 and don't have kids, and you're not coaching kids, you probably don't realize this, but that is the big place to make money other than traditional endorsement deals. So he is someone who could be looking at making some money, a significant amount of money if this comes up. And so, but I guess my point is not that he exists, but that the fact that I don't know if the average person would think of even somebody who's the reigning Mr. Basketball being somebody who was going to make a lot of money, because the way they could make money is not the way you would necessarily think about it in the first place. And the social media thing has also been a major talking point with a lot of college athletes too. And there's a handful, I'm sure there's more than a handful, but there's a few well-known examples of that, even some girls basketball players and stuff who just have big followings on social media. Then sometimes it's halfway not even necessarily specifically because they're good at sports. It's because of their personality or whatever else. And those have been people who have been put up already as able to make a lot of money on this kind of a thing, especially because the social media thing. One thing is there's just not a lot of extra time for people to go out, these athletes at either level, to go out and do some of the work that it would take to justify earning their NIL money, except for if you can just pay somebody to tweet or post it on Instagram, which takes 5 seconds, then that's another way to kind of bridge the gap and make it worthwhile on both sides. And as an aside to that, I would say I am a little skeptical about, I know a lot of digital marketing is completely bogus, so I would actually be curious to know how much of the idea that you can market this is monetizable, all these social media followings. I would actually like to know if that's actually true, or it's just something that people are saying that it would be true, and then after a period of time, there would be kind of a bust on that too. Although that's just completely an aside on my part. Maybe people who know more about that could set me straight, but that's also something I would just kind of throw out there as I wonder about that myself.
Well, Marcus does not get paid to tweet, at least as far as I'm aware, but he is on Twitter. Marcus, let people know where they can find you on Twitter.
You can just follow me at Marcus Hartman on Twitter, MarcusHartman. I don't have any branding or anything like that, so nothing special. And I only use Instagram. I don't use Instagram at all for work purposes, and I often forget that it exists. But apparently, I'm told that kids have moved on from Twitter and they're much more active on Instagram and I believe TikTok as well. So, which I do not use TikTok either. But so I get I talked to Gabe Cutts' dad, and he said, yeah, because I mentioned to him that if you follow a lot of these, athletes who are like, I'm not saying super famous, but the guys who are at least like Ohio State football players or whatever, they don't do much with 99% of them do nothing with their Twitter feed other than when they were in high school, they shared an update here or there about their recruiting and they retweet people who say nice things about them. And that's about it. And he said, well, that doesn't mean they're using social media less. It just means they're using Instagram or something else instead. So that is something that I confirmed, at least in the.
Well, you obviously have been doing a bunch of reporting on this already. As I said, you were at that meeting. That you were how I was following along that meeting. I was following you along on your Twitter feed.
Because it is worth pointing out that a lot of these times, something gets considered and then whatever. But this case, if it passes, that will become effective immediately. So, like a kid in high school on May 16th could sign an endorsement deal like that. It doesn't wait till July 1st or doesn't have to be ratified or signed by the governor or anything like that. That's just as soon as they count the votes and they find out that if it's a yes, that will go into effect right away. And if there's any recourse for people who want to do it, otherwise, and how quickly it might take to, I don't know if they'd have to wait a full year to reconsider it again, or who knows, maybe there would be something where there could be a governor's executive order the next day too. I don't think that's necessarily high on their list of priorities, but it's also, I suppose, a possibility. But that is something we will know for sure what is happening on May 16th.
All right. Well, circle your calendars for May 16th. Follow Marcus on Twitter so you know when it's happened, and make sure you check out all of our other great podcasts. We'll probably be talking about this a little bit more on one of them, maybe more of them. You can find them all by just searching Buckeye Scoop wherever you find this show. And you can subscribe right there and leave us a 5-star rating and review as well, which will help other folks find these shows as well. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.